Resuming debate, the honourable member for Nanaimo Cowichan for her 5 minutes of reply.
Great. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I want to begin by acknowledging many of my colleagues and also members from the Liberal Party who are speaking up in support of this important piece of legislation. And I have to admit to feeling some frustration after listening to the Conservatives outline a program that's clearly not working. If it was working, I wouldn't have to stand here in this House and propose a piece of legislation to deal with the problem. We know throughout Canada that there are hundreds of derelict vessels, both on coastal waterways and in inland waterways, and this is a problem for many, many members in this House from coast to coast to coast. So I'm baffled as to why the Conservatives will not support this first step. And I acknowledge it's a first step. And in my brief period of time, I want to tackle a couple of concerns that they've raised. First of all, there seem to be four main areas where the Conservatives say they can't support the bill. The first one is they say that this would force the Coast Guard to deal with every derelict vessel, which would adversely affect their operational capacity. Well, Mr. Speaker, if they had read the bill, they would understand that I included a provision that would allow the minister to set out in regulations the circumstances where the receiver of wreck was not obligated to take measures to deal with a derelict vessel, by doing so under the regulatory process that allows the public to have a say in what and when they think vessels should be dealt with by the government. And Mr. Speaker, clearly the intention of this bill is not to have the receiver of wreck, the Coast Guard, deal with absolutely every derelict vessel, but we already know that the problems that provincial governments, municipalities are having, which has been ably outlined by members such as the member from Esquimalt, how difficult and complex it is for other levels of government to deal with this, and that we do need some clear definitions about when a derelict vessel needs to be apprehended. The second part is the Coast Guard. The Conservatives say that the Coast Guard is not a standalone department. It is part of Department of Fisheries and Oceans, so it cannot be made a permanent receiver of wrecks. Well, actually, under the Act and the regulations as they currently stand, the minister can designate any entity or individual as a receiver of wreck. The status as a standalone entity doesn't matter because the power to designate still resides with the minister. So this bill does not change that ability to have the minister designate the receiver of wreck. Thirdly, the Conservatives are claiming that the cost of dealing with derelict vessels will now be borne by the government and ultimately by the taxpayer. And that is nonsense. We've already seen that the government is currently already having to pick up expenses. Again, the member from Esquimalt pointed out the $40,000 that was spent in cleaning up a vessel, and then the additional $100,000 that had to be spent in dealing with a derelict vessel when it had been torched and otherwise dismembered. So nothing in this bill removes the obligation on the owner of a vessel to pay for its disposal. That is why the receiver of wreck must take all reasonable steps to contact owners before taking action, because those owners are responsible for paying the costs. And as currently happens right now, every effort is made to track down the owner and have them pay for those costs, but we also know that there are many cases where it's simply not possible to identify the owner. They're deceased, they're out of the country, whatever. So, Mr. Speaker, it still is incumbent upon the owner to be responsible. If we wait for all derelict vessels to become navigation or environmental hazards, the cost of dealing with them goes up. And again, we've seen that in cases. The longer a vessel remains derelict, the more costly it becomes to remove it. By giving a receiver of wreck the ability to contact the owner upon observing a wreck, this legislation may help prevent vessels deteriorating to such a point that the removal or disposal becomes a costly burden. And finally, Mr. Speaker, the government is proposing a public relations exercise that's going to tell owners about their responsibilities. I have to tell you, many owners already recognize that there's a life cycle issue with vessels, but part of the problem is there's nowhere to recycle these older vessels. And again, my colleagues have pointed out there's actually a business opportunity in recycling these vessels. So, Mr. Speaker, I am hoping that some members of the government will recognize that these derelict vessels are serious problems in their own riding, and that they'll actually have the courage to stand up and support Bill C-638 so that we can take this very important first step in dealing with a problem that this government has ignored for the 11 years that I've been elected. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.